Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Building Sustainable Collaboration Stories from Hamilton, Ontario, and Newfoundland. My name is Ruté Ojigbo, and I am a Senior Community Animator for the Building Youth Futures team here at Tamarack. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to acknowledge that we are all meeting on Indigenous lands. I'm currently located in Waterloo, which is the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land. We encourage you to share where you're calling from in the chat. So just before we begin our discussion, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So we have Mike Des Jardins, who is the Manager of Sustainability and Development for the Building Youth Futures team here at Tamarack. We have Tom Cooper, who is the Director of the Hamilton Poverty Reduction Roundtable, as well as Joshua Smee, the CEO of Food First NL. Welcome, folks, and thanks for joining us today. Just before I hand it over, this webinar is part of a four-part series on sustainability and resilience, and it is based out of our 10 guide, Building a Sustainable and Resilient Collaboration. The first webinar took place last month, and we explored what it takes to develop a sustainable, resilient, and impactful collaboration, as well as explored how collaborators can build resilience, questions around funding and funders. And today we're going to go a little bit in depth into some stories and lessons learned from collaboratives in their sustainability journey. So with that being said, I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Ruté. And thank you to everyone for joining us today to hear stories of sustainability. Before we connect in with Tom and Josh and get into those stories, I thought I'd take a few minutes to quickly overview sustainability. I like to use the metaphor of a tree where the tree trunk is the collaboration. It's the people, the structure and organization of the collaboration. And then the branches and the leaves are the projects and programs and activities that support the collaboration's compelling case. These can change and some get more growth than others and some die off. Then there's the roots, and they're the contributing sustainability factors and resilience practices used by a collaboration. They collectively feed and support the trunk to continue to thrive. And so really the roots are the foundation for the collaboration. And so today we're going to be talking about that roots system. In the first webinar in our series about sustainability and resilience, we talked about the 10 factors that collectively support sustainability. So we have a slide that captures those, but I'll just quickly go over that they fall under 4 categories. The first one is people. These are about who to involve and include things like equity and inclusion in design, strong ties between partners, and broad community engagement. Another set is resources. These are about the investments required and include things like adequate human and financial resources and partners who are contributing to shared outcomes. Another set is process. These are about the why and the how of the collaboration and include things like having a compelling case that drives the work and ongoing reflection and learning as a collaboration. And then the final set is impact. There's nothing better that sells success than success. So these are about the effect and influence of the collaborative effort in telling the story and include things like an approach informed by data and evidence, tracking and reporting progress and impact, and influencing policy and systems change. In 10, a guide for building a sustainable and resilient collaboration that you see in the chat, you will find detailed descriptions for each of the 10 factors and specific actions that contribute toward building sustainability within a collaboration. And in section 6 of the guide, you will find 10 inspiring stories. And so we're so lucky to have 2 of those inspiring stories of sustainable collaboration with us today, the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction and Food First NL. These 2 collaborations are network organizations and conveners. They engage in social policy work and advocacy as they aim for systemic change. It was really my honor to get to know their work better through the development of the 10 guide. And I'm excited for Tom and Josh to share their stories with you now and talk about how sustainability plays out on the ground. So the first question for Tom and for you, Josh, but we'll start with Tom. Tell us a little bit about the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction.
Thanks, Mike. Good to see you again. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. The Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction has actually been around for more than 15 years now. And it came together as a result of a recognition that child poverty was completely unacceptable in our city of Hamilton. At the time, there were 1 in 4 children growing up in low-income households. And so our city council wanted to see some action. And so the the manager of the city's social services department, as well as our local community foundation, got together and really convened our roundtable as a group of concerned individuals and leaders who really wanted to change the dynamics of where we could influence policy change. We recognized there was a lot of important work being done at the ground level, helping people with their daily crisis. And there were fantastic organizations like food banks and homeless shelters and other social service agencies. But there wasn't really an organization committed to looking at the upstream effects of how poverty was impacting local people. And so that's really where our roundtable came together. And we started working in a little bit of a different way. The first several years of our collaboration was really about building relationships and understanding the challenge that we were facing. And then when I became director almost 10 years ago now, we really started to dive deep into social policy advocacy. And so we looked at the 50,000 people, for example, in Hamilton who were relying on provincial social assistance and often living in the deepest poverty in society. We looked at the challenges facing working Hamiltonians, many of whom were going to a job every single day, but they weren't earning enough at their jobs to pull themselves or their families out of poverty. And so we talked about living wage. We also felt it was really critical to involve the voices of those who were directly impacted by poverty, those who were experiencing poverty themselves. So we ensured that our table constituted at least 50% of people who were themselves experiencing poverty, and their influence and vision really led the development of much of our policy work in the intervening years.
Great, thanks, Tom. And yeah, building in that equity right from the start is so important for sustainable action. Josh, tell us a bit about Food First NL.
Sure, yeah. Very similar story in some ways to Tom's and to the roundtables. So we've also been around for some time. This is probably 22 years, I think it would be this year now, for Food First. And we used to be called the Food Security Network, and that probably gives a hint to kind of the way that things were formed. We came together in the year 2000, 2000, out of a group of folks who are working on food, primarily nutritionists and dietitians, actually, folks coming from that more kind of clinical angle or medical system angle on food, who are really concerned that there wasn't enough capacity to talk about the social determinants of health and the social determinants of access to food. And that there were this growing interest in grassroots action around food systems. But as is true, I think, in most communities, a lot of that's happening in a very small scale, right? You have a ton of folks working in a small project in a neighborhood here or in a small community there, and there wasn't capacity to connect them with each other. And so that was the kind of the groundswell that created Food First, originally as primarily a network organization to connect those folks with each other, and to do the kind of ground truthing that needed to happen about what solutions could look like. So from the beginning, a big part of what we've been doing is what we call community-led food assessments, which are pretty much what it sounds like. We do community-based research within usually a single community. It might be a small town, it might be a large city, to really map out what the folks who live there see as the gaps and the strengths of their food system, and to move forward on really localized implementation. So that's always been a big part, and especially in the early days was a big part of what we did. And then as the years rolled on and the organization picked up capacity, so it was many years before we had, for example, a full-time staff person. And then we did eventually, grow our team and start to pick up more capacity to do a bunch of different things. And now the way we divide it up is into what we call 4 strategic pathways in our work. So we do a few different things. We do advocacy, and I'll say that's become a much bigger part of our work in the last few years. We'll probably talk about that a little bit in the course of this conversation, but I think some of the shifts in how collaboration is happening that have happened because of COVID have opened some doors for us to take a more active advocacy role in the community. And we've built it into our formal strategic goals, where we used to be, I'll say maybe a little bit risk averse about the A word, so advocacy is one pillar. The other pillar is organizing. So getting people together, creating those convening opportunities for people who are working on food and often might feel isolated because they're doing a project in their community and they don't know the folks who are doing a similar project elsewhere. And then there's a third bucket, taking action, and that's where we're running programs directly. So there are times, not all the time, but there are times when it makes sense for us to take the lead in an on-the-ground program. And sometimes that's where we see an opportunity for a new way of doing things that we want to try. And hopefully it'll get picked up by others. We don't want to own programs forever usually, but we have a bit of flexibility as a more established organization that we can often find money more easily than small new organizations. And so we can go try something, proof of concept, and then it becomes maybe a part of the landscape a bit more. And then the fourth kind of pillar for us of our work is valuing people. And this is another place, I think, Tom, where we intersect more these days, perhaps, than we did in the past, is that integrating the voices of lived experience in a more structured way is becoming very important to our organization. So we'll talk a little bit about that probably later, but to say that that's a big part of our work and resourcing that appropriately and making sure that there are those spaces for the voices of lived experience. I'll say maybe the final thing for us is, as a food systems organization, these conversations get quite complex because food connects with everything. And as a food systems organization in a geographically relatively isolated place, the conversation about food doesn't always start in the conversation about, say, poverty here, right? The conversation about food security in Newfoundland used to be really driven by the experience of walking into the store and seeing the shelves being empty because the boat didn't show up, which is actually quite a different lens to have on food and on food systems. And so part of our work has been to try to draw those conversations together. Sometimes there are, I would say and we still experience this in our work, there are sometimes 2 circles, folks working on what I would call food systems. Those are folks who, their portfolio of work might have more to do with, say, community gardens and farming and food production, and then folks working on poverty. And I've been frustrated over the years that those 2 kind of lenses on food don't connect as much as they should. And so a big part of our work these days is trying to draw those 2 conversations together as much as we can. Not to say that they're the same, but bringing those different angles on the food system has been really important for Food First as we move forward. And now I think in our province, we're in an interesting place that Newfoundland and Labrador, just almost maybe by accident, we're in a really profound moment of policy change, or at least policy change opportunities. So we had a health accord process, which is aiming to kind of reimagine our healthcare system, or reimagine health in the province. And they came back and said, we have to reimagine the social determinants of health. We can't fix this through healthcare. And so we're now, I think there's a real opening there. We're bringing in a new social and economic well-being plan, which is kind of a poverty reduction strategy 2.0 here. We had a really successful one about 10 years ago. And then there's an all-party committee studying basic income. There are just a whole bunch of big moving processes here. And so for our organization now, we really see this as a moment when it's kind of go big or go home. That those doors don't stay open, and you rarely get this alignment where so much could change. And so that's really guiding our work, I think, and how we're thinking about collaboration and what we're trying to do with it right now.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, you know, that 360-degree view of what's going on is so important, to be able to tap into opportunities that present themselves that maybe you weren't ready for, but then also to build capacity, you know, as you were saying, at sort of the local level in communities, to then be able to pick up these opportunities with you as you journey together. Okay, so now we know a little bit about both of your collaborations. So now let's get into what sustainability means. And we've found that that's a really important thing to start with, defining what it is for your collaboration. So I invite you, Tom, to start. What does sustainability mean to you? And if it's different, how does your collaboration define it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. I think for us, sustainability is a lot focuses a lot around ongoing adaptation and I think learning and being able to be nimble when we need to. Being able to recognize that that the environment is changing and that we need to sometimes move with the time. So I'll just use one example, and Josh referenced basic income. So in 2017, Hamilton was chosen as one of the pilot sites for the Ontario Basic Income project. And at the time, we of course were focused on income security for our members, but that was primarily around social assistance reform, which we weren't having very much success in moving the dials on improving social assistance. But we saw basic income in the pilot really as a new opportunity to really engage the community and also importantly enhance the well-being of low-income community members. So 1,000 people in Hamilton were randomly selected as participants in the basic income pilot, and there wasn't another organization out there that was really providing support or information on what this all meant. And so we thought it would be important for us to shift our priorities to really trying to support people who were participating in the basic income pilot, work with the evaluation team to try to understand what it meant and how having a basic income may improve or may potentially harm people. And then some of you may know the sad story that the pilot was canceled as well, and so at that time, we felt it was important for us to advocate on behalf of those participants whose lives were thrown into chaos. So that's just one example of being able to sort of move fairly quickly from one priority into another area that it was still a major focus around income security, but we were able to move and sustain our work in that sort of analysis. It's
a great example, Tom. How about you, Josh? How do you define sustainability?
Yeah, I started in almost the same place as you, Tom. That sustainability to me is more about shifting than about staying still, and so like having the same project be the same for 10 years is not really what I'm envisioning when I think about what sustainability really is. Like that gets a bit too close to stagnation in my mind. That I think for us, sustainability looks like being able to make sure that the right folks, and I mean that kind of really broadly, the right folks are in the room for the conversation that needs to happen right now. And that changes a lot. It means, but it does mean having kind of the ability to move to where those areas of opportunity are, and like for us as well, basic income has become, and maybe a different way they did in Ontario, because here what's happened is that the basic income is like very seriously on the table as a policy option, and so we've leaned all in on it. And I've been able to throw staff time to backbone some of the local organizing, multi-agency organizing around it. And so maybe the other piece I think for us that sustainability connects with is, I think sustainability and scale do go hand in hand to a certain extent. So one of the things that's helped for Food First is that by Newfoundland and Labrador standards, we're relatively large. So by now we have 15 staff, which is quite big, in our province. And we haven't been that big for that long, but we've had enough people around that and enough projects on the go that when we want to have some sustained engagement on a particular issue or an area, we can generally make it work. You know, so like the mix of funders and projects that is allowing us to stay attached to something will change a lot. But what we've, I think, learned to do is build out our organizational structure in a way that we can fund it through the ways that we all fund our work, you know, like project this and that. But in the core, we have people here in my shop who are great people who understand the broader issues and can stick with them, right? Even if their title or their responsibilities on paper shift from time to time. I think that's the other piece that's been for me is not so much that the collaborative stays the same, but that you are able to keep people and keep some institutional connection to an area of work, right? And that has, and so scale has really helped us with that. That we can fairly consistently apply ourselves, and it's not as big of a decision for us now to say, here's an area where we think something could happen. Can we put a quarter of a person's time on this for the next few months and just like see what comes out the other end, right? And like there are ways that we can make that work. And so that wouldn't be true as much if we were a one-person shop or a two-person shop. And so I think that has made the difference as well.
Sure. And, you know, I think it's about being values and purpose driven versus opportunity driven. Like, sure, capitalize on opportunities as they come up, but they should be guided by that overarching value system that you've created for your collaboration. And that's the strength in continuing towards a movement. And I'd agree with you, Josh. You know, if you've been in a collaboration that's been doing the same work for 20 years and you're not moving the dial, it's time to rejig, right? Like, look at what you're doing and how you can have that impact. Because as you said, you know, scaling has to happen at multiple levels. And if you're just doing it at the local level and you're not hitting those systems, you're not going to have that significant impact to move that dial. So, okay, so thanks to you both. So now let's get into some of the factors. What are some of the things that have led to you, to your collaboration being sustainable? And we've touched on a few of them. Are there any other ones that you want to add?
I think for my part, Josh mentioned funding, and certainly for the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, it's been helpful to have sustainable and predictable funding from two core partners, the City of Hamilton as well as the Hamilton Community Foundation. We're now also under the auspices of Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, which is serving as our in essence our backbone organization and fiscal sponsor. But that having the ability to know that we can continue this work has been fairly helpful. One of the other things that has been helpful is, I think, having leadership around the table from a diverse sectors across our community. So we have leaders from academia, we have nonprofits, certainly business leaders. Chamber of Commerce has been surprisingly very supportive of our work, and on the policy level, including basic income and living wage, right there with us. We've had media as well, and certainly the role of the Hamilton Spectator has been reported on in the past, but really being able to have a partnership with a major news organization in the community has been incredibly helpful. And then looking at our success coming out of the gate as a roundtable, we had Paul Johnson, who was our first director of the roundtable. He's now gone on to bigger and better things. He's now city manager for the city of Toronto. Our second director was Liz Weaver, as many of you will know, is now co-CEO of Tamarack, and it's recently honored in Davos, and then there's me, but we won't get into me. But I think having leadership around the table, both from a staff perspective and from those volunteer board members, has been really incredible. And I mentioned this before, the voices of lived experience has been absolutely essential in terms of highlighting which policy advocacy we need to go after. So that's been helpful for us too.
Yeah, and it really is all about the people, right? If you have the right people around the table to move action forward. And one of the things, and I don't know if this is a push to you, Josh, but when we had talked about your story for the guide, you talked about engaging the unusual suspects. And so Tom is kind of referring to that when he thinks of the Chamber of Commerce and other folks. So maybe that's been helpful to you as well.
Yeah, it has. It's funny, I'm talking to you guys from a hotel room. I'm just about to go do a community meeting with a folks who own a small store. We have a big project now working with retail partners, because we said, like, this is kind of bonkers that we're talking about food security and we're not working very much with the places that most people get most of their food. And so now we have this big province-wide project to engage particularly with small community retailers who are really, very aware of what's going on in their communities, and that there are people who face a lot of barriers to accessing food and want to be a part of the solution, right? And so, just today, after I finish this call, I'm going to drive out to Lethbridge, which is a town of about 400 people. We're going to sit down with the retail partner we have there and the community and say, what can we do differently around this? And that's, I think, a good example. We opened applications for that project, and we had dozens and dozens of retailers from across the province saying, we want to be part of this, because we sit as gathering spaces within our community and as third places for small towns, all these things. And so that kind of engagement has always been a big part for us in bringing in, those folks from government departments who might not normally be brought into the circle on some of these conversations. I think one of the advantages from my perspective, one of the things that's helped us, and this is maybe the other thing I was going to mention here, is there's kind of the emotional, compelling case that we can lean on as a food organization. People have this very emotional relationship to food. I'm very conscious sometimes of the fact that usually what we're really talking about is poverty, right? But sometimes it's easier for people to understand their way through poverty when they think about it through a food lens. And it's sometimes allowed us to bring people around the table for a conversation who might have shied away a little bit from a poverty reduction lens on things. And like, I'm always conscious there's some tension in that work, right? But that has really, I think, been a part of this. And the other thing, Tom, you were saying, I do want to lean on too, is I think for us, in terms of another big factor, has been thinking about communications as a core part of the work, not as like an ancillary part, right? Like that it's not the thing, we don't like do a thing and then communicate about a thing. Communications is a thing, right? And there's a distinction there, I think. Like we've been lucky, we've had a series over the years of really good dedicated communication staff, which is something I always like advocate for with other organizations. Is it's a great investment to make, and it means that I think our organization has played a role in shifting the way that the whole province talks about some of these issues. I think about it a lot when I do a lot of media, and even in the 3 years that I've been here, a good part of what I used to have to spend the first half of an interview explaining to people, now the interviewer does that in the context setting. And that's like a really important piece, I think, for collaborations, is to be able to set the terms of the conversation, right? And we notice that when we spend time talking about that in public, that gets reflected back to us from policymakers, right? That they've heard a radio conversation where an issue's been framed a certain way. And we actually have it written in our communication style guide that our goal is to make radical ideas less radical. So we'll just kind of introduce radical concepts and just treat them as if they're normal. Because I think one of the things we do is we step too carefully sometimes around some of the big system solutions. And basic income is, I think, a great example of how this can shift. Is like, basic income is not a radical solution. It's like a policy thing that, at least here, it's just a policy option that's being considered and weighed and figure out how do we pay for it and what would it look like and what's the mechanism. But there's not a lot of debate over it as as something that should or shouldn't be considered. And so like collaborations that we've been a part of, I think have played a role in that, just by normalizing the conversation about that as a solution, or normalizing the idea that like income is the solution to food security, not food. Like these kind of pieces. And so, yeah, like Tom, to your point, I think having like good relationships with folks in media and those good reciprocal conversations really have mattered.
Yeah, and it's the building of the trust for me that I've heard a lot about sustainability, that if you build those trusting relationships, then you can tap into them when they're needed, whether that's media or funders, because, let's be honest, funding is often the biggest thing that people think of when they think of sustainability. How do we have money to continue to go? But if you have the relationships in place and people that are willing to contribute, there's a lot of things that you can get done without having that funding. Now, that's not to say that we don't all need to advocate for unrestricted and long-term funding to support these kinds of systemic work. But in the end, we can make things happen on smaller budgets when we have everybody contributing. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about challenges. What are some of the challenges that either of you have encountered in navigating sustainability?
For my part, and this has come home for us in certainly in recent months, and recognizing that the pandemic particularly changed a lot for particularly, I would say it hit low-income people first. It hit them hardest, and they're the last to see any sort of benefits from any sort of recovery. And so it's been really important for us in terms of trying to sustain interest when so much of the there are just so many innumerable challenges in the world, and so that means sustaining participation and involvement of our low-income community members. Using an example here in Ontario, there's as in many other places all over Canada, we've seen huge spikes in costs of living, particularly, as Josh has said, for food, for certain, also in terms of affordable housing. And meanwhile, here in Ontario, social assistance rates have been frozen, and so it can become very easy for our low-income community members to get frustrated that things are ever going to change. We saw the cancellation of the Ontario Basic Income pilot, and sort of sustaining that idea that there is hope on the horizon somewhere can be incredibly challenging, I think. And I don't have a good response, except to say that we need to keep pushing. We need to keep building for that better future, demonstrating through evidence-based research that there are alternatives to the way things are right now. So that's one piece of it. And also for a collaboration such as ours that has been around for a long time, sort of reinvigorating our leadership table and ensuring that we can call on new voices in the community to be part of that ongoing conversation and adapt to where we see things going in the future.
Yeah, so Tom, when you were talking about hope, we think of these sorts of intangibles as things that we don't need to invest in, but they are so important, right? I think that's why Liz and I decided to break up the concepts of sustainability and resilience in the 10 guide, because what you're talking about is that resilience and that ability to weather the long term. And that involves people and how they feel about being involved. And so it's about encouraging the health of individuals and the people that make up the collaboration. So, we talk about collaborations as these entities, but they're made up of people, and they need to feel good about what they're doing, and that what they're doing is contributing to making change, right? So, yeah. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of big challenges that come to mind. Just to riff on that a little, and thinking about the health of people, I like, especially right now, what's top of mind is like the well-being of our team, to be honest with you. I think like none of us maybe have fully grappled with what the last few years have meant to people. There's not a lot of gas in the tank for lots of folks, and that is really, like, if there's one thing that keeps me up at night about being able to like keep making impact, it's that I'm actually not that fussed about money. We'll figure out the money part, but the humans I worry about, and because it's a grind, and people's sort of wellspring of resiliency in their own personal lives is pretty depleted right now, and so like that's, I think the thing that worries me the most, or the thing that challenges the most. The other one that we face, I think, and maybe I think structurally, Tom, you folks are actually, as an organization, structured more as a formal collaborative than we are. For example, like we sit as a like a nonprofit organization that's a convener. And so one thing that happens when we're convening collaborations is that unless we're pretty intentional about our design and structuring of them, they end up being an exercise in goal setting just for Food First. And that's not what we want it to be. Like we don't want to host a big convening that just generates an endless to-do list for us that lets other people kind of off the hook. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I think one of the things we're always trying to think out is like, how do we construct an action plan that really gets buy-in from people who see themselves in one facet of it, right? And so like that's an ongoing challenge for us. You know, we've done kind of more formal collective impact process work over the years. We've done less formal versions of that. You know, we're kind of helping shepherd a food action plan in the city of St. John's, for example, of which the vast majority of the action items are things we would never be directly involved in. But I do think like that is one of the challenges that happens that's like directly related to, we were talking about scale earlier. So like one of the things that's strengthened us is that we've had that scale, but as the scale grows, it becomes more tempting for the dynamic to be just like, let's have Food First do it, which is not what we want to see. And that's not healthy for like the ecosystem around us. So I think like that's always going to be a tension in our work of figuring out like, when does it make sense to bring this into our own work? When does it make sense just really clearly try and identify it? How do we sort of hold people's hand into picking up this piece of work within their own organizational structures when there aren't that many organizations whose mandates are like purely related to the thing that we're working on? So I think that's the other side of this coin here, is thinking a little bit about that.
So what are some, because you both kind of touched on the concept of succession planning, whether that's leadership or partners or staff, what are some things that you might be able to suggest people could try out with their collaboration around succession planning?
I think one of the things we did try when our roundtable restructured, probably really the first time in around 2011, 2012, was really reaching out to the community and seeing who wanted to be part of the conversation. So we had an open call for members. For example, previously it had kind of been leaders in the community tapping each other on the shoulder and saying, here, come be part of this, but we wanted to open it up more. And so I think that brings a more equitable lens, certainly to the conversation, the ongoing advocacy, but it also brings in people, you know, like we've talked about, those unusual suspects who we may not have considered, who want to be part of the conversation and want to be part of the solution. So I think opening up opportunities to those who have a lot to contribute is really important. And again, I've talked about this already, but the voices of vulnerable groups in the community can be absolutely critical to sustainability, and ensuring their buy-in and their leadership, I think drives these sorts of collaboratives forward.
Yeah, Josh?
A couple of things occur. One is, where we can, providing opportunities to resource people's work in their own kind of passion areas that are not directly sort of part of our work, but connect to it. So like provide some pathways for folks that don't necessarily start at, you know, get a full-time job with such and such organization, but provide a pathway for people to start getting involved in this work in a way that works for them. So we just finished an 18-month-long process of a community-led food assessment in St. John's, which is very different than doing it. We've done them historically often in small communities. Doing it in a big city is quite different. One of the models we used was we had a team of food animators, we called them. And the way that worked is basically we paid these folks, and part of what the money went towards was paying their time, but also we were able to support them in a project of their choosing, food systems project. So, there was a community composting project that was supported through that, for example. But then those folks were also doing the kind of ground truthing and information gathering for the broader food assessment process. And that gave and a number of the animators are folks with lived experience of food insecurity. Some were more kind of community activists who wanted to just, kickstart a project. But those kind of little flexible ground level things that lets you maybe flush out the folks who really want to work on this issue but haven't found an in to do it, I think matter a lot. The other one that I think about from a kind of succession planning perspective in the partnership building space is being a bit more intentional about transitioning our relationships from relationship with person to relationship with organization, right? So and that's touchy sometimes, right? So there are lots of relationships of trust that exist for us that are really specific to one of our team members. That's someone who I might have worked with personally for 10 years. And we've been in different jobs together over the years, and there's a bunch of trust built up. How do I transition that interpersonal trust to a relationship level trust, right? And start bringing in other people from my team into those conversations. And it's not just me, right? There are also what happens when there's a really solid personal relationship from someone elsewhere in my team who we want to try and transition that into a different part of our partnerships. I think just thinking a little bit more intentionally about what that looks like and not holding on too tightly sometimes to our personal relationships with people is part of it, and something that still challenges me, to be honest with you. And in a small community like Newfoundland, Labrador is about the same size as Hamilton, right? So it's similar dynamics in that way. We all know each other, and we through different jobs and roles, and so it's sometimes hard to separate these things. But when you can start sort of bringing other faces into those conversations, that's helpful, I think.
And, when you were both talking, I was thinking a lot about going back to what you need, right? At the time, the people that you need, and then trying to remove certain people's sort of names and faces from your mind and going back to what do you need? So Josh, you talked about, a collaboration over years having to be flexible and change as time goes on. And so the people that you will need around the table, whether they be partners or, leaders or people with lived experience, need to change as well. And so I think there's lots of ways that you can do that. There needs to be a transition for institutional knowledge so that the people that are participating have the ability to participate at the same level. There aren't people around the table that get things and other folks that don't, depending on the jargon. And then I also think that there needs to be some mentoring of the folks with lived experience. If you've never been around a collaboration table before, just inserting someone into those decision-making tables can be kind of overwhelming, right? So if we know well in advance that people need that kind of mentoring, we can stagger people's exits and entry points, right? Tom, did you want to throw in something?
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things we did was create a social inclusion policy as well for our folks with lived experience. And that gave them the opportunity to participate, sort of at least feel that they could participate a little bit easier than might otherwise be the case. So that could include funding for transportation, meals, that sort of thing. A lot of us get paid to attend these kinds of meetings, but oftentimes people with lived experience are expected just to come and volunteer their time, right? And that's not necessarily right either. So I think recognizing that their time is valuable and their expertise is valuable, and building that into our processes as well.
Yeah, one thing we've started doing on that, Tom, it's probably a bit similar to your process, is when we're doing kind of grant applications for whatever at the project level, how all of us probably, we carve off X% for kind of administration, but we also now do a carve off for inclusion on almost all of our grant things without specifying. Whatever we can, we'll just carve off a percentage that says inclusion and specify some general things that could be spent on, things like honoraria, childcare, whatever. And then that kind of goes in a pool so that we have the resources to do that, to make sure people are paid for their time, and then we can get people there. And I'll say that's been way easier to do in the last couple of years. People don't poke at that budget line in the way that they used to, which I really appreciate. And so because sometimes we don't know how we're going to spend that money. And we can't give people a line item, a breakdown of it, but it's been really useful to be able to make sure that there is a bit of flex around around being able to make sure that, exactly, like it could be childcare, or it could be some very random expense that's impossible to describe to a funder, right? But that, like, there is a bit more space there now, I'd say.
Yeah, I think funders are getting that now, that need to have that built in. And I think the key to what you're both saying is that, it doesn't have to be the traditional forms of labor that we would be getting volunteers to do. Just valuing people for their time and their energy, being able to make it out. Another layer could be having childcare, child minding, in case if that could be a barrier. Providing transportation, whether it's bus tickets or taxi chits, or it could be providing food even at meetings, so that depending on what time you're having it, you can't expect that people who have been working all day have the ability to fit in getting something to eat. So it's making sure that people are taken care of and valued overall, right? Yeah. I just want to remind everyone as we come closer to the end to put any questions that they might have into the Q&A. We've just got sort of one left at this point. What's next for your collaborations, Josh and Tom? Like what should everybody be keeping their eyes open for? And maybe Josh, if you want to start.
Sure. And this is a place where I think we have lots to learn from Tom and his team. We are just in the process of launching our own formal long-term lived and living experience advisory group. And one thing we're trying to do, which hasn't been done very often as far as we can tell, is we're doing a province-wide one. So we're recruiting around 15 people from across the whole province who will meet remotely for the most part. We're going to get everybody together to start and meet each other and hang out for a few days. And then beyond that, we'll be on Zoom with each other. And that group is going to be there. Well, we don't know what they'll have a chance to set their own agenda and give themselves a better name than Lived and Living Experience Advisory Group, right? But like, I think one of the things we're hoping to see is that group will exist for a while, and we'll be able to provide a bit of policy accountability to folks with lived experience. Because one thing we see now is, like, our provincial government's super good these days, or better than they used to be at consulting with folks and at paying them. There's more childcare, there's more honoraria. It's much better than it was even 5 years ago. But then people never get consulted again once the policy's been implemented, right? They never get checked with to say, like, how does what we did stack up against what we asked you about? And so, like, that's kind of the niche that we're hoping that group will fill. And so, like, we're pretty excited about that. And it's been a long time coming. The other thing we're doing is, again, I think just a structural piece to an organization like ours. We're adding a network of, we're using the food animator term again in a slightly different way. We're putting regional animators down in every region of our province. And their job is mostly just to get people talking to each other. Like, they're going to be the person who pays attention to food systems things, who knows that Buddy over here is doing a community garden and should connect with Buddy over there, who's doing a meal program for a community center. Here, let's get you talking, let's find you some money. That kind of pretty basic community development work, but it's been a little bit absent at that regional level. And so we're pretty excited about that too.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Tom, what's up for you?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So on the sustainability level, we are looking at how our roundtable will maintain its sustainability over the next few years, with innumerable new pressures following the pandemic, certainly, and challenges here in the community. So we're going to be having a number of strategic conversations, I think, over the next several months to look at kind of reinvigorating our group, bringing in some new leadership, probably a new chair, and really finding those voices out there in the community who need to be part of the conversation. So there's that. On the policy advocacy level, more to the point of recognizing there are challenges out there that maybe nobody else is addressing. Over the last few months, we've been working on with some great community volunteers, looking at the idea of addressing Hamilton's huge homeless crisis. And one of the ideas that has emerged in communities like Kitchener and in Kingston and elsewhere across Canada is the idea of building a community of tiny cabins for people who are living rough on the street, and we don't have that in Hamilton right now. And just looking at some of the successes that has enabled people who are living rough to get some safety and improve their well-being and really just sustain people out from the cold is really important. So we're moving forward on that idea, sort of recognizing that nobody else in the community is working on that right now, and so we've sort of been a backbone organization for a group of volunteers who are pursuing that idea, and we're hoping to get Hamilton's first tiny cabin community off the ground soon.
Great, yay. You know, and so as both of you were talking about, I was thinking of two resources that Tamarack has that could be helpful. We have a 10 guide on lived and living experience that we can put into the chat, and maybe that will be helpful for you, Josh. And then Tom, so Liz and I, after developing the 10 guide, we created something called a sustainability self-assessment tool. And that might be helpful for collaborations and leadership tables to come together and say, okay, where are we? How are we defining our sustainability? And then take a closer look at how to untangle that a little bit. What are the elements that need to be sustained? One other piece that I would just like to suggest, and I always want to add this to every conversation about sustainability, is not everything does need to be sustained. That hasn't come up specifically here, but you know, if it's no longer working, maybe it's time to move on for a reason. I'm sure both of you have had experiences with that. And it's being savvy enough to know, stop investing in that, or find the people who are able to do that work and take it off the plate of the collaboration. I think of another story in the 10 guide from Calgary Reads. And so they were doing quite well with their programming on early years literacy, but it wasn't shifting the dial the way that we were talking about. And so they've decided to, all their dandelion partners, when you think of a dandelion and you blow off the white things, the seeds from the dandelion, they've blown out those programs so they continue to exist, and partners have taken on that work, but it doesn't need to be owned by the collaboration anymore, because it allows you to refocus and spend that energy in the things that you need to move your case for support forward. So we've just got in Ruté, did we have any questions that we need to go over?
Yes, I see one from, sorry, Harry in the Q&A panel. So it says, what role do you play in conflict resolution between collaborative partners that might not directly relate to the collaborative work, but is impacting the group and the ability to move forward in a cohesive way? I don't know who wants to take that on first.
I can say a couple of things about that. I think like one of the strategies, this is more a personal one than an organizational strategy. Sometimes we just push through and pretend that people don't have conflicts with each other and treat them as if they're like rational humans who should work together. And sometimes that works. Like sometimes you can kind of put a person in a position where it's too awkward for them to get in the way anymore. And so sometimes that's our strategy, and as an organization actually, is just to treat people as if they will behave as if you would hope that they would behave. Like treat people as if we're all working together on such and such thing. And sometimes people, especially bringing people into larger circles, like if there's a conflict between two people in this kind of broader network, we'll often just bring people into a looser, larger circle, and they're less willing to disrupt it. Can be the dynamic for us. And that doesn't mean that the conflict is solved, right? Like they can go on fighting amongst themselves all they want, and it's that we don't usually invest ourselves in trying to solve all these things. But you can, I think, sometimes by like finding the right scale of conversation, you can get around some of that. That's been our approach often.
How many thoughts for you?
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add, and certainly sometimes it comes up when looking at policy priorities. So I just brought up the example of the tiny cabin idea, and you know there's a bit of push and pull in our community right now, looking at where should investments be put. Should they be put upstream in terms of keeping people housed? ensuring that that people don't become homeless, or is there also the importance of recognizing that people are homeless, they're living on the street, their lives are at immediate risk? So where do you focus your priorities? And I think having those conversations are really important. It may end up that you do some sort of balance, or maybe a 90-10 split, who knows? But I think keeping the lines of communication open are really important, and breaking down those silos and recognizing that at the end of the day, we're all trying to do what's best for community members. We may have different thoughts on a direction to achieve those goals, but I think keeping that communication wide open and having conversations is really critical.
That's great. Yeah. And it's all about sustainability is built right from the beginning. And so all of these relationships, if you lay the foundations properly right from the beginning, it helps you navigate the conflict management further down the road when you build those norms and values right in from the beginning. So I just want to say thank you to Tom and to Josh. Thank you both for sharing your stories today and for your passion for sustainable action and change. Just as we exit, we'll pass it over to Ruté, but do you have a couple sentences to say about your last words of advice around sustainability?
Go be sustainable.
Do it.
I think don't worry too much about it. I think like worrying gets in our way,
Yeah, no, it's true. Okay, over to you, Ruté.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Tom and Joshua. This was really great hearing about your collaboratives and all the work you're doing in your sustainability journey. Just a quick closeout here, Jamie will be putting in upcoming webinars and other workshops in the chat, so feel free to click on those. We will send you the recording and any links and resources that were mentioned, and we'll also send you some information about Food First and the Hamilton Poverty Reduction Roundtable as well. I'm sure we will be working with them in other areas at Tamarack. Just looking at the time, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Tom and Josh, again for sharing your stories. We really learned a lot. And yeah, we'll also put feedback, a form in the chat too. We would love to hear your feedback on how you think the webinar went, and what topics you would like to hear from us later on in the future. Thanks everyone for joining us. We wish you a good afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day.